All right. Cool. All right. Everybody, you guys can collect around. We'll go and kick this off. So first, just a little bit about myself. My name is Devin Cartwright. I'm a resident here at East Lake 1. I've lived here about 3 years. I'm a naval aviator. I fly the gray helicopters you guys see flying around. I will probably be moving here sometime this upcoming summer. And I'm going to be a flight instructor in Florida. But so yeah, what I wanted you to do, what I wanted to do for this was kind of teach you guys the very basics of fishing. Some of you, I think, already have experience fishing, so this will just be a little bit of a refresher. For others of you, I believe this is kind of your first time ever fishing. So we're going to cover the basics, and I'll go ahead and kick it off. So first off, we'll start talking about fishing rods, okay? The things we're going to cover today: fishing rods, fishing reels, fishing line, fishing tackle, and other associated fishing tools that are probably useful to you. So, like I said, we'll go ahead and start off with fishing rods. As you can see, we have different types in front of us, so I will go ahead and cover. Let's start with fishing reels, because it's easier to see the difference, because all rods kind of look the same, okay? So the first one I'm going to start off with is probably the one a lot of you, if you fished as children, are familiar with. This one is my daughter's rod and reel, but this type of reel that you see here, the one with the button on the back, this is called a spin cast reel. It's very common in like children's rods. You see like this. They do make like full-on, like high-end professional ones, so it isn't just for children. The thing that's great about these is that they are very easy to master, because all it takes is pushing a button and knowing when to let go for it to cast, okay? That's kind of why people like these. It's also hard for the line to get tangled up. It's they can be bulletproof, okay? So they're very, very good for beginners, and then some people never go away from them. They just love them so much that they keep using them. On the opposite end of the spectrum, this is called a bait caster. These are kind of more the upper echelon style fishing reels that you'll see people utilize. The benefits of these is there's a lot of control over where you can put baits. Typically they're used for fishing for sport fish like bass and things like that, okay? We will not be using these today. I might be using this one, but these take a certain amount of practice and experience to become really good with, so that you don't get the line tangled, because that's actually very easy to do on these. But what we will be using today, and what you see in front of you mostly, these are called spinning reels, okay? They're actually kind of like the middle ground between the spin cast that you saw and the bait cast that you saw. These are very easy to use, and they're a very basic design. They've been around a really long time. So the benefits here, typically for fishing reels, all fishing reels, they have what's known as a drag. The drag is what allows you to kind of tire a fish out, right? So as you pull a line, you can hear it clicking right there. That's the drag working. So if a fish is on the line and he's heavier than the drag you have set and he's pulling, that drag is spinning and it's slowing him down. If you don't have drag on a reel, oftentimes what will happen is the fish will just swim until it breaks your line, if your line isn't tight enough, or strong enough, or if your knots aren't good enough, okay? So today, this is what we'll be using. If you've never cast a spinning reel before, we're going to practice casting with these before we really move on to trying to catch fish. Does anybody have any questions about fishing reels specifically? All right, well, let's move on to fishing rods. So fishing rods, they kind of all look alike for the most part, but they're a little bit different. The two main types, one is what's on the bait caster here. You can see all of the line guides are on top of the rod instead of a spinning rod, which they are all on the bottom, okay? And that's because of the position that the reel sits on the rod. So don't ever be the person with a spinning reel fishing it like this, okay? That's upside down. Don't ever do that. They hang automatically like this. This is how you want to be fishing them, and this is how you want to be holding them. Typically one finger in front, one finger in back of the reel stem. You just hold it like this, okay? For fishing rods, they come in any number of lengths. You'll also hear they come in different types of materials. There's glass or fiberglass, which is this one right here. They come in graphite, which is extremely sensitive. That's what this one is, graphite. They come in composite mix between the two. They also come in various lengths. So you can see this one here is really short. This one here is a 4'6". They go all the way up to 14 feet and anything in between, okay? The thing that can get confusing for people is what's known as rod power and rod action. So think of power as the strength or the backbone of the rod. Essentially, for instance, this right here, so the types of power are ultralight, light, medium, medium heavy, heavy, extra heavy. That's kind of how they lay them out. But if you see kind of how whippy this rod is, I could not pull a tuna out of the ocean on one of these, right? Because this is an ultralight rod. This is designed for fishing for small fish or fishing with very small baits. Whereas this one on the very end here, this is a medium heavy. I could take this one out into the ocean here. I could pull 15-pound halibut out of the ocean. So the power kind of determines, for the most part, probably the weight of the fish that you're going to be going after, okay? For everything that's going to be in this lake behind you, what's currently in it and what's going to be stocked, you don't need to go as high as a medium heavy. In fact, I would focus on a medium power rod and below, so medium or medium light. That's kind of where I would focus. That's going to allow you, if you don't have that light, it's okay. It's just going to make it easier to catch the fish. But what they're going to do eventually is they're going to stock bass and bluegill in the lake. Bass and bluegill, you can catch them on this. I catch bass on this all the time. So you could go as small as an ultralight, and it's going to make the fight a lot more fun because they're really like pulling that rod, you know. But medium power or medium light is kind of what I would recommend for everything that's going to be in this lake here. Now let's talk about the action. Think of the action as how quickly the rod springs back to its natural position when you let it go. You saw how quickly that went? It's because this is a fast action rod. Pops right back. Whereas if I take this one, this is a moderate fast, so it's slightly slower is what it's called. If I let it go, it bounces around a lot more, okay? The speed, or the speed of the rod, the action of the rod, can determine how sensitive it is. So think of if this were very, very stiff and it did not, because it's a fast rod, right? You're gonna feel every little tap that happens on this. Whereas if you have a very slow rod, and they make slow rods where you can let it go and it's like, you're not gonna feel a lot, okay? There's various benefits to the different speeds. Again, and it becomes a trade-off. So the faster the action, the more sensitive the rod is gonna be. The slower it is, the less sensitive it's gonna be. However, depending on what type of hook or bait or lure you're fishing with, you may want to have that slower action because it helps to keep pressure on the fish and it helps keep them hooked longer. If I were to use a very, very fast rod that barely deflected, and I used a very small like treble hook like this, it would probably rip right out of the fish's mouth because you're putting too much pressure on that fish. You want something a little bit slower, it keeps it pinned, okay? And we'll talk about that. Are there any questions about fishing rods?
This one says medium heavy.
That's fine. Okay. Yeah, you'll be okay. In fact, it's just gonna make it really easy to catch the carp today.
Okay.
You won't have to fight them. You could probably just turn your drag all the way up and just start reeling, and you're gonna reel them right in. So,
okay.
Yep, it will work. Okay, let's move on to, so we've talked about the rods, we've talked about the reels, let's move on to fishing line, okay? There's 3 basic types of fishing line. There's certain combinations of in between. The first one, probably the least expensive, is going to be what's known as monofilament. That's this right here. Comes in all kinds of brands, all kinds of weights. So all fishing line is rated, at least in the United States, is rated by weight. So this, for instance, is 8-pound test. So that's about what the breaking strength is. If I pull on it with 8 pounds, it should break around 8 pounds. Sometimes they'll say it's 8 pounds and it'll break at 10 or 12, and that's just by the manufacturer. But it also helps you to determine the diameter. An 8-pound line, which breaks around 8 pounds, is a much smaller, thinner line than a 100-pound line, which is going to be really thick and really strong, right? So that kind of helps you understand. For what we're fishing here, I don't recommend you need to go anything over about 8 pounds. 10 pounds is fine, 8 pounds, 6. You can go as low as 4. This has 4-pound line on it. You can see how tiny this is. I was catching carp out here yesterday on this line, so it will work. But the problem with that is you have to be much more careful when you're fighting the fish so that you don't just break the line, okay?
And too big could be bad in what way?
Great question, actually. So too big can be bad because the bigger the line, the more stiff it is. And if you put, for instance, you can see how small this reel is. If I put 20-pound line on here, it's going to be really thick for one, so I'll actually get less line on it. And 2, it makes it really hard to cast. So big lines typically go with big baits because you want that line to be able to be pulled off of the reel very easily, okay? So going too heavy can be a detriment. You also, let's see, so for instance, with the rod you have, right? That one, and a lot of times the rod will tell you what kind of line it's rated to. I probably should have brought that up. So if you guys look on the rod, for instance, this one here says 2 to 6 pounds. So this one recommends 2 to 6 pound line go on the rod, okay? So that can be helpful in knowing what you should be getting to put on it. Additionally, your reels, I'm glad we're backing up to this, your reels also often have a recommendation on it. They'll tell you how much line of a specific weight can go on there. For instance, on this one, it says 4-pound line, I can get 75 yards on it. And that's what I have on here. It's 4-pound line. I probably have about 75 yards. So marrying up your rod and reel together to be similar specifications along with the line is how you get the best performance out of all 3 of them. Okay? All right. So we talked about the monofilament line. It's also called nylon. So it's really just kind of like an extruded plastic. One thing that monofilament line does that some of the others don't is it floats. So if you're using a bait that you want to float or a lure that you want to float on top of the water, you want to be using monofilament. The other thing is it's actually stretchy. I can pull on it and it has stretch to it. That can be good for, so because of the stretch, you lose a little bit of sensitivity, but going back to things like the treble hooks, you may want to have that stretch so that you don't pull the hook out of the fish's mouth. Additionally, it can provide, if you use it as a leader, and we'll talk about leaders, but if you use that as a leader, it can act as a shock absorber so that if you go to set the hook really hard on a fish, it'll absorb some of that shock again so you don't rip the hook out of the fish's mouth. So, least expensive line typically floats, has a good stretch, and it's also abrasion resistant. So if you run it over rocks and trees and things like that, it doesn't chafe up as much, so it's a little bit more forgiving. Probably a really good selection for beginners for those reasons. Next thing is fluorocarbon. This stuff is clear, like the monofilament is. Monofilament does come in different colors. You can get it in reds, blues, greens. This one's clear. You can see on this one, it actually is almost a green color. So you can get it in different colors. Not really important on the color. People have their opinions on it. It's nothing you guys need to worry about now. If you do any more research, you might decide to use a different color based on the fishing conditions. But next one is fluorocarbon. Fluorocarbon line is clear like monofilament, but when it's underwater, it's actually invisible. Because of the material it's made out of, it refracts light away instead of reflected. Monofilament reflects. So this is really good for fishing around skittish fish who might be scared of your bait, right? That you don't want them to see. This has a little bit of stretch, but not as much as monofilament. Okay. Typically, it's thought of as not having any stretch, but it has a tiny bit of stretch. And then this line sinks as opposed to floats. So if you're using baits or lures that are on the bottom of the lake, this is what you want to use, is fluorocarbon. This is less abrasion resistant than monofilament, so it's a little less forgiving, but because it has less stretch, it is more sensitive, okay? So, recap, invisible, less abrasion resistant, but less stretch, so more sensitive, and it sinks. And it's typically a little bit more expensive than monofilament is. The last basic line is braid. This stuff is almost like dental floss. It's actually made of fibers that are woven together. This one right here is 10-pound test. So some of the benefits of braid, it has no stretch. So this is extremely sensitive. You will feel every single bite. If you are pulling your bait along the bottom, you'll feel every single rock that you run into. So it's great for sensitivity. It's great for detecting very small bites. It's also very strong. It's abrasion resistant. It floats, so it floats like monofilament does. The downside to braid is it's typically more expensive. That's really kind of the only downside. I love braid. In fact, most of these setups that we have out here today will have braid as the main line, and then we tie the rest of the bait on after that, or the rest of the setup on after that. But I like it for the sensitivity. Another benefit. So this is 10-pound test braid. 10-pound test monofilament is going to be significantly thicker than braid is. Braid is very, very fine. So you can get a lot more of it on your reel than any of the others, okay? So that can definitely be a benefit. And then braid comes in all kinds of colors. You can see this is a bright green. When I go with very small line like this, I prefer to use very bright colors because it makes it easy to see it when it's in the water. Because if you don't, it just disappears and you can't see it, and that can be kind of annoying. The other downside to being, rather than being just expensive, is if you use straight braid and you tie your hook or your bait or your lure right on the end of this, the fish can see this underwater. So it is not recommended for most fishing styles or techniques to tie directly to your lure or your hook, okay? You want to use a leader being another piece of line that comes after this that has your hook or your bait or your lure on the end of it. And you can use either monofilament or fluorocarbon as your leader material. That way there's a gap between your main line and the lure, and it doesn't spook the fish. There are specific knots where you can tie two lines directly together. We're not going to get into that today, especially since we're fishing for carp. The carp setup that we're going to be fishing with today, we're going to be using a swivel, and we'll be talking about that here shortly. Does anybody have any questions about the fishing line? No? Okay, awesome. So, we'll talk a little bit about lures and hooks and terminal tackle. So we'll move into that now. So I talked about most of these have braid on them, and then we're going to tie a leader on, right? So what we'll be using to tie a leader on is called a swivel. If you guys want to step forward, if you can see it better, you're welcome to do that. But a swivel is literally just, it allows the line to rotate, and you can tie two different lines together really easily without having to know any special knots to be able to do so. Swivels come in different sizes. Typically the bigger they are, the stronger they are. For what we're doing here, this is a big one. I just brought it out to make it easier to see. We're going to be using smaller swivels today, and I can send you guys out examples of what you should be using to do all this so you can set up your own equipment. For fishing for carp, I still recommend you use this, and I'll show you the setup here in a minute. So, next we'll get into weights. So there's all kinds of different fishing weights. You have things that are called bullet weights. It kind of looks like the bullet from a gun. These are typical when fishing things like worms for bass and things like that. The line goes right through the middle with the bullet facing up away from the worm. Show you. So it'd be like that on the line, okay? And then you can either, typically what people do is they just let it slide on the line, okay? So if you cast it out, it actually will go ahead and the bait will trail behind it until it gets down to the bottom. Again, that's a little bit beyond what we're going to be talking about today. Other weights you might be familiar with if you fished before. Oops. This is called a split shot weight. It literally kind of looks like a Pac-Man. So what you'll do is you'll run your line through the jaws of the Pac-Man, and then you'll use pliers to crimp it shut on there. It's an easy way to quickly put weight on your fishing line. Very common when fishing with bobbers like we have over here. You want to put this underneath the bobber, and what that does is it keeps your bait below the bobber and pulls it down when it's out in the water, because that's what you want to happen. It also helps when casting, because if you don't have enough weight under the bobber, your bait and stuff will wrap itself around the bobber and get all tangled, so it's kind of cool. So split shot, that's another common fishing weight. This little cannonball looking thing, this is called a drop shot weight. Drop shot weights come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes. Sometimes they're a cylinder, sometimes they're a teardrop, but essentially this gets tied on the very bottom, the very end of your line, and then your hook is tied up above that, and you'll hook a bait or something on that hook. And what it's designed to do is keep your bait, if I had like this worm on there, it keeps your bait up off the bottom for fish that like to feed up here. And then the one we're going to be using today, this is called an egg sinker. This is going to go on our main line above our swivel, and we're just going to let this free slide on the main line. What that does, especially for fishing for carp like what we're doing out here, is it allows the carp to take the bait and start swimming away with it, and they don't feel pressure from the reel or the line because it just slides right through the weight. If we were to tie this on, as the carp pulled away, it would feel the weight and it would let go of your bait. So that's what we'll be using today. Now we'll talk about some lures, and then we'll talk about hooks last. So we're not going to be using any lures today, but eventually when they actually do stock bass and bluegill and stuff out here, lures might be useful to you. So lures come in more types and categories than you can even imagine. I only have a few out here, a few like popular ones. So this is what's known as like a curly tail grub. It's got a little tail here. These are very common for bluegill, crappie, species like that. Bass will also eat these, but essentially the hook is exposed, and as you swim it through the water, this tail is going, and fish think it looks like a tiny little fish swimming, and they'll come up and they'll eat it. You can even go bigger on swim baits like this, using a hook like this, and as you're swimming it through the water, it just looks like a bigger fish. One of the most common types of lure or bait for bass fishing is just a simple worm. This is a plastic worm, commonly referred to as a Senko, S-E-N-K-O, Senko. These come in all kinds of colors. This one's like a watermelon. It's got a light green with black flakes in it. They come in like reds and blacks and blues and purples and basically pinks and any color you can imagine, to essentially do what's called match the hatch. So what you want to do is, if you know you're going after bass, you want to mimic what bass eat. So if this looks like a bluegill in the water and bass eat bluegill, they're going to be more likely to eat this bait. Okay? We're not going to talk about how to rig this up, but there's so many different ways you can rig it. Those are considered soft bait lures because they're that plastic material. Then we get into hard baits. So this is what's known as a crankbait. It's got this lip on it, and you tie your line to this little ring, and as you reel it back through the water, this nose makes it dive down, and it swims like a fish underwater. These are treble hooks. We'll talk about hooks here in a minute, but most crankbaits have treble hooks like this. They have 3. It makes it a lot easier to hook a fish. They almost hook themselves if they bite it, so you don't have to like set the hook to really make sure that they get hooked. They just kind of hook themselves. And then this is a similar one. This is just called a lipless crankbait. Lipless because it doesn't have this lip on it. These guys float. So if you cast out and you just leave it there, typically they just sit on the surface of the water. They do make sinkable ones, but this one floats. So if you reel it down and it swims down and you stop reeling, it'll float back to the top and you can do it again. This one sinks, it immediately goes to the bottom. So if you don't want it to be on the bottom, you have to continuously reel it, but it will wiggle like a fish coming through the water as you retrieve it. You can hear a lot of them have rattles in them. That sound actually attracts bass because that's what bait fish sound like when they're underwater, believe it or not. We can talk more about different lures and things like that going forward, especially if you decide you want to fish for a specific type of fishing. This right here, this is called a jig head. It's got this little lead piece on here, and then the bait it's like this. This has also got a jig head on, and you can see you put your bait on, the hook is exposed out the back, and when the fish bites it, they get hooked because the hook is out. This hook right here, this is called a bait holder hook, and it's hard to see unless you're up close, but a bait holder hook has these little barbs up here on the shank being the part that goes from the eye down. This is designed to, when you have a worm or a minnow or something like that, if you thread it up the hook, these little barbs hold it on the hook to make sure that some fish doesn't come along and just steal your bait right off of it. So, see that? See the little barbs on it. That'll be really useful if you guys decide to come out here with worms, bobber fishing. Very common to use this style of hook, this bait holder hook. Especially when fishing for bass or bluegill. Size on the hooks matters. We'll talk about size at the end of hooks here and what they mean. This one's called an Aberdeen hook, that underneath the bobber. This one I like live worms on something like this. This is for plastic worms. And there's a special way to rig it, but again, we won't go over that for what we're doing today. And then this one, this is the hook we're going to be using today. This is called a circle hook. You can see the tip, how it curves back in towards the shank. So circle hooks are really, really good for live bait rigs that sit on the bottom of a lake. So you could put a minnow on this, cast them out with the exact same rig we're going to be using. If you want to fish for bass, and if they allow us to use live bait, this hook turned inwards like this, it's called a circle hook. It's designed so when a fish takes it and turns to swim away, they hook themselves. A lot of these other hooks, like the worm hook especially, you have to do what's called setting the hook. You feel the bite and you have to jerk your rod tip upwards in order to get that hook to pierce through the fish's mouth. This one, the circle hook, really all you have to do is start reeling. And the fish is swimming away, and it just puts enough pressure on it, it pierces automatically. The fish does what it does, it tries to get away, it pierces itself more. So that's what we're going to be using today. Let's talk about hook sizes. So there's 2 metrics of hook sizes, and they either have, in fact I got a perfect example right here. This right here, you see this 1/0, that means 1 aught. These are aught sizes of hooks. This one here says number 2. There's no 0 after it. These are both the exact same hooks. These are both mosquito circle hooks, which are what we're going to be using today. But you notice they're different in size. So when there's not a 0 after it, the bigger the number, the smaller the hook. So it's counterintuitive. So I have a 6 right here, even smaller than the number 2. Okay? But when you get into the aught size hooks, the bigger the number in front, the bigger the hook. So just remember that. When there's no aught, they're inversely related. When they're got the aught on them, they're bigger the higher in hook size you go.
What size do you have for the setup here?
So it depends. Some of them I believe some of them I have the 1/0. So this is probably a little big for carp in the lake. Most of them I've gone to a 2. Some of them I have a 6 on. What I've actually found just within the last couple days is I'm having a harder time hooking up the carp the smaller I go on hooks. Because what they're doing is they're taking the bait in, and when I go to set it, it's so small it just comes right out of their mouth before I can actually, because you're not supposed to set the hook, you're supposed to reel. So I start reeling and it just comes right out. I have actually found I've had a way better hookup ratio using bigger hooks. So what I would recommend is we're going to start, most of these today I think have 2s on them, so this should hopefully help on the hookups. I don't have any number 1s with me, which is the next size between a 2 and a 1/0, but a number 2 or a number 1 I think is probably going to be good first. So that kind of covers hooks, terminal tackle. Does anybody else have any questions about that stuff? No? All right. Now, I'm only going to teach you 1 knot today. This is the only knot, if you're a beginner, that you probably need. There are hundreds of knots, and there are many knots that are better than this knot. This knot will work 90% of the time for what you need, and it's what we're going to be using out here, okay? So I brought this to represent my hook eye, just to make it easy, and I got some rope right here to make it easy to see. This knot is called an improved clinch knot. So what you're going to do, you're going to take your hook eye and you're going to take your line, you're going to put it through your hook eye 1 time, okay? So it's like this, your hook's dangling underneath. You take your hook and you're going to spin it all the way around 5 to 6 times. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, okay? You still have this end in your hand, right? This was the end you put through. There is a small gap right here at the end of your hook eye. You're going to take that and you're going to push it through that, okay? When you do that, it makes another loop. Put it through that. Anytime you tie a knot, no matter what it is, you always want to wet it. So I hope you're comfortable spitting on your hands because it's going to happen, but you're going to spit on the line, okay? Because if you don't, the material that it's made out of will rub against itself, it'll burn, and it'll melt, and it'll break. And you don't want that to happen, okay? So wet it, and then all you got to do is pull it tight. And I use my teeth a lot. It's also kind of hard on this rope because it doesn't want to slide, but essentially it's going to slide all the way down to the, there you go, to the hook eye, like that. So that's an improved clinch knot. What you're going to have is whatever's left over here, this is called the tag end, you want to trim it off. Always leave a little bit, just in case your knot slips a little bit, but trim it pretty close, okay? Leave like no more than 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch, so pretty short, okay? I'm pretty bad about it. I just use my teeth, I just bite it off, but you should probably use pliers. So do as I say, not as I do, okay? So that's the knot you're gonna need to tie today. So what we'll do, because I want you guys, if you haven't tied an improved clinch knot before, some of you guys are kind of new to this, I have a couple of them that have not been fully set up yet, so I'll let you do it up here so you can get the practice, and you can ask any questions about how to tie the knot. But before we do that, a couple other things I recommend for you to get if you're going to be fishing pretty often, especially out here. Carp are slimy. They are very, very slimy, and they get heavy. I caught a 5-pounder out here yesterday, so if your gear is very light, like this one is, you don't want to just reel it up and try and bring it up on the shore because you'll break your rod, okay? Or your line, and the fish will fall in. So I recommend a net of some kind. This can be purchased pretty inexpensive. This one's actually pretty small, but I brought it just for demonstration purposes. I recommend pliers of some kind, fishing pliers preferably. Fishing pliers are different than just regular pliers because They are going to be rust resistant, and they also often have cutters on them for cutting line, which is useful for cutting braid, because you do not want to try and use your teeth to cut braid, okay, because it's just not going to work. So, and then it's useful for getting hooks out of fish's mouth, especially with these circle hooks. They rotate into the mouth, and you have to grab onto the shank and you have to rotate it out backwards, because that barb that's on there is used to pin the fish, okay? Likely going forward, and I'm going to be talking to the homeowners association here, but they're probably going to start using barbless hooks here in the lake. So they use barbless hooks at East Lake 3, which also has a pond. We're not allowed to fish it because we're not, residents. But barbless hooks. So as you can see on this hook right here, you can see this little barb. That's designed to keep the hook from pulling out of the fish's mouth. It makes it a lot easier to catch them. So without the barb, it's a benefit to the fish. It comes out a lot easier. It doesn't tear up their mouth and things like that. But it does make it more difficult to catch them. So it's going to add a little bit of a challenge to it all, but it's okay. Once you guys know what you're doing, you shouldn't have any issue. The last thing I recommend for fishing is getting yourself a good set of polarized sunglasses if you don't have them already. The benefit of the polarized sunglasses is when you're looking at water, the sun reflects off of the surface, and that's where you get that like bright reflection in your eyes. Polarized sunglasses are designed to block that out. I won't get into a science lesson about how it works, but essentially there's filters on the glasses, and the light waves move in a specific direction, and those filters keep that from getting to your eyes. So it actually allows you to see down into the water, and you can see the fish in the water. Not always, especially with how murky this lake is right now, but sometimes this lake clears out, and you can see them a lot better. So, and then the bait we're going to be using today, very simple, it's corn. So, very inexpensive, carp love it, and even fish. Until I'm done for the day, if I have corn left over, I just throw it out in the lake. It feeds the fish, it feeds the ducks. Don't gotta worry about it. They don't catch bluegill out here. Carp will also eat this. In fact, I caught 4 or 5 yesterday using just bread. So, really inexpensive baits to be able to fish with to get you guys started. But that's it. That kind of covers, I think, all the basics you guys need to know to get started, at least catching carp out here, okay? So again, my recommendation, just summing up, my recommendation, get yourself a medium or medium light rod using a spinning reel. One thing I didn't care about spinning reels is they come in different sizes. So they're usually in thousands, so 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. The bigger the size, the bigger the number, the bigger the reel, okay? So 3,000 or less on the size. And then for your fishing line, I would say just go with a simple monofilament because it's inexpensive. Go with 8 pound. It's gonna be fine for anything you're gonna catch out here. And then I'll show you guys the rig and how we set it up. And then you guys will be able to do this on your own afterwards. A little plug, you see a lot of this symbol on a bunch of the gear that I have right here. I'm affiliated with a fishing brand, a fishing company. It's called Cast King, one of the biggest fishing brands in the United States. So I basically know about every product that they have on their lineup. If you guys are interested, you're going to be fishing with all Cast King gear today, fishing rods, fishing reels. If you end up liking the stuff you're fishing with and you want to know more about it or where to buy it, let me know. I can point you guys in the right direction. I can give you any advice on that stuff, okay? All right, well, let's go ahead, and who would like to practice setting up the rig and also tying in the lake? For today, we're gonna throw them back because I haven't gotten the go-ahead from the president of the Homeowners Association yet, but eventually they want to pull or remove the fish from the carp from the lake because they think that they eat other fish's eggs and things like that. They out-compete other fish. They don't want them in here, so they're going to ask us to remove them. We're going to do an entire event probably, and it's going to be an entire day, and everybody's just going to go out and catch every single one they can. And the reason we're waiting is we don't know what we're going to do with them yet. We might give them to some local Asian markets to be used as food, or we might just throw them in a trash. So Yeah, that's a great question.
Bonk them on the head or something?
You can, yep, you would bonk them on the head. That's a typical way of dispatching a fish. If you're going to keep it to eat it or throw it away or whatever, you don't want fish to suffer. I know, it's thought of probably as a lure. So typically a rock or a big stick, you hit it right on top of the head, right where the brain's at, it'll kill it instantly. It won't feel any pain. So disease off of them. So try not to handle them too much and get them back in the water. Sometimes you can't help it. A fish is going to flop around because it's trying to get away. It's going to fall on the ground. But try not to put fish on the ground if you can avoid that as well. Pick them up by your hands, hold them, take your picture, throw them right back in the water. Okay?
Is there a thing where you like revive them or you put them in the water to swim around a little bit? I saw it on TV once.
Yeah, yep. So that is a common thing, especially if you've had the fish out of the water for a while. Typically what you'll do is you'll take the fish, you'll put it back into the water, and you'll either hold it by its mouth or by its tail or whatever, and a forward and back motion or a side-to-side motion to get that water flowing over their gills again will get them to kind of revive and they'll swim. Usually if you get them right back in the water within a few seconds, you don't even have to do that. They hit the water and they're going to be gone. But if you had to find a minute to find your phone, fumble around to find your phone or whatever, get the hook out of the mouth, take your picture. It may have been a while. Yeah, you may want to revive them in the water.
How much corn do you use?
So we'll get to that. Really only like 2 or 3 kernels on a hook is all you need. There are specialized carp rigs that you can tie. I have some videos on my YouTube and Instagram. If you guys are interested, I can send those out to you, especially if you decide you want to catch carp more. I have a very simple step-by-step tutorial that goes through how to tie fishing for carp, and I can give you guys that so you can see what it is. Yeah. Any other questions?
What is the hook with the 3 bars?
Thank you. Yeah, I think I didn't talk about that. Treble hook. Treble hook. So yeah, those are very common on hard baits like that. They typically don't get fished by themselves. You can fish for like trout and things with this, but these things are notorious for getting hooked in everything. So if you want to catch a fish, this one's pretty useful, but yeah, it can tear a fish up. So there's some people who even, when they get a lure like this, they'll take the treble hooks off and they'll replace them with single hooks. Just, again, for being that conservationist, take care of the fish. Any other questions? No? Nothing right now? All right, does anybody want to come and practice setting up the rig, or I can show it to you guys real quick? Okay. I have the rods from basically beginner down to expert for experience level. You guys are welcome to pick whichever one you want. There's a couple of them that still need to be set up. So if you guys, I see some of you have your own stuff, so if you want to use that, that's perfect. But for the rest of you, you can come pick whichever ones you want, and then if it's not set up yet, I can set it up for you. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pause my live. We're going to be back in just a minute. We're going to get the group together. We're going to go fish, see if we can catch some fish.